After 4 games, it seemed like the book had neatly been closed with Apocalypse. But even with the peak of an idea, it seemed the tape was still rolling. A series that had technically graced 3 different systems, it only made sense that there was one more to appear. The PlayStation 4 is a murmur, a looming fog on the horizon of the tide. This was to be a new handheld, a sequel to the PlayStation Portable. The PlayStation Portable they gotta come up with a better name than that. This is the PlayStation Vita. Vita specifically in Latin meaning life. I really hope that doesn't come to be a dreadful irony one day. Phones and tablet devices are gaining more and more power by each day, and as a result the games are becoming more and more playable on these devices. These are becoming the new handhelds. It's a strange turning point, and I mean shit. Max Payne is fully playable on an iPad. Nevertheless, despite this shifting tone, Sony went all in on a new handheld device. A touchscreen, rear trackpad, front and rear facing cameras, a lot of useless gimmicks that I'm not all that interested in. But what it does have is a right analog stick, making this handheld one of the most playable ever seen. And more importantly than that, the system's no slouch, delivering a home quality experience that just couldn't be done before. Uncharted Golden Abyss positively excels on the system and really does prove just how well this system can work with the home console counterpart. BigBig Studios even got in on it from the start with little deviance. There's a neat selection of launch titles and a promise of more to come. And speaking specifically to genre, there must have been a few racing games, right? From the fast-paced futurism of Wipeout 2048 to the customizable jaunt of Mod Nation Racer's Road Trip. Even Ridge Racer got in on the action, and no, this one was pretty shit, but the other 2 were good. Needless to say, the system could easily handle the racing titles as well as any other. So that left Evo with their own unique shot to take. After Apocalypse seemed like a pretty good thematic peek to both the concept and the mechanics, it really did beg the question, what could they do from there? The system didn't pose much conflict in terms of capability, but it wasn't going to be easy making another big game. Instead of making something bigger, why not make it smaller? When I say small, I mean really small. Like RC car small. Oh cool, yeah, they showed those in Apocalypse. It seems like a pretty good place to take the series. Bombing around in these miniaturized vehicles, slamming into each other, having a good time like the old days. It's an entirely new gameplay style and perspective. It resembles that of Micro Machines. Oh, well, that's okay. I mean, I fucking love Micro Machines. I mean, this is gonna be great. It could complement the other games in the series, and it could end up delivering on its own unique tone. No, it's just made up of other areas from the other games. Well, they're really going in on this, huh? Well, that's okay. I mean, it'll be cool to see the old environments back, in the same design structure with the surface differences. The tracks are short and very linear, and there's very little interaction going on. It shares more with MotorStorm than just an aesthetic, right? Bro, the boost is gone. They took out the boost? No. A digital store exclusive. It's free $99. What? Oh no. Oh god. It's happening again! I am trying my best to give this game its due, but there is not a lot of game to give that due to. It's fine, it makes a pleasant enough first impression, but the game wears itself out very fast. There are quite a few reasons why, which I will get into, but for the most part, it comes down to a sort of underdevelopment. Like the game needs a lot more focus and attention put into it, but it just isn't there. It's a slightly uneasy and uncomfortable game because of its unsurety. As much as there is bad in this game, there is also a lot of good too, and that's what I plan to acknowledge. It should also be said whatever similarities there are to the other games, be that locations or vehicles, the game as a whole, at least in terms of mechanics, is very distinct and quite different from whatever MotorStorm was before. For that reason, I don't feel it's all that necessary to delve in too far to what this game is, as it's much more simplistic than it appears. The irony of saying that, of course, is that this game does appear simplistic due to its price point and its overall scale, but nevertheless, it's even more shallow than it initially seemed. One of the most notable places where this appears, of course, is the vehicles. The large vehicle roster has been somewhat maintained, with a few interesting caveats to go along with that. The most important worth noting is that a lot of these vehicles handle very similarly to each other. The other caveat is that a few of these are almost downright useless. But before I get ahead of myself, there are 8 classes: super minis, racing trucks, monster trucks, buggies, rally cars, big rigs, muscle cars, and supercars. Strangely enough, this is the only game in the series, if it can be considered the series that is, to not include the bikes or the ATVs. It's understandable though, as these are RC vehicles, but the mud pluggers are also gone. I find the roster of vehicles in this game to be the most confusing aspect of the whole experience, and in some ways quite frustrating. To put it fairly simply, vehicles vacillate between being reliable cornering machines to untrustworthy shipwrecks that spin out at every fucking turn. The game's sandbox is too small to be able to show off nuanced differences between the vehicle classes. 3 of these feel almost identical, whereas the rest, some of them are pretty good, and some of them are just terrible. There's a lot of very sharp turns, and the way the camera works, these sharp turns won't be seen until very late in the process. Unsurprisingly, that means the grip-heavy vehicles, like the super minis, end up doing a lot better on the track. But swing it on around to the buggies, and the game becomes almost unplayable. They're very fast, sure, but they slip out on every corner, and they feel needlessly difficult for a class that was always meant to be the all-rounder. The supercars that are unlocked very late in the game's progression are way faster than the buggies, and have slightly better grip, and they're considered a bit of a joke class. But the difference between the supercars and the buggies is not all that large, which begs the question, why are the buggies here? The game is full of lapses of logic like that, and to be perfectly honest, for the most part, I find the vehicle differences to be somewhat nonsensical. In the first MotorStorm, the vehicle classes are each given their own unique grade for what surfaces they work best on. It didn't mean they were outright useless in places that they shouldn't be, just that they had their own specialty. And for a game of this scale, I can't help but wonder why they didn't just go with one unified class with heavily customizable parts. If it's dirt, if it's sand, if it's ice, or asphalt, every surface handles more or less identically each time. A simple retuning mechanic for each event would have worked really well. And it's especially noticeable because the game does kind of play around with the idea a little bit. Muscle cars in this game have a specific use, as they can only be used in the drift events. They're pretty quick, and they slide around a lot, which makes them very useful for power sliding in the drift events. It makes the class feel important because it has its own specialty, as opposed to the other vehicles in the hierarchy. On the other end of this, the supercars are a good example of why the system hasn't been done well. Supercars are unlocked by getting at least one medal in each of the events between all of the festival. As I stated earlier, these are considered a bit of a joke class, and the events they go along with, time trials, are considered even more so, as some of these last less than 17 seconds. It never really feels like a true victory getting one of these, instead just sort of dumb luck. I can understand why they didn't want to make a unified class, sure, but these are remote-controlled cars, and it's sad to think that the game where that's even in the title, they never actually even get to be their own class. And this may sound completely pedantic, but RC cars don't actually handle like real cars. They're speedy and wily, and they're light enough that they can be thrown into the air. I'm not making an argument for some kind of realism, it's just that MotorStorm has never had a vehicle class that puts those traits together. The closest would be the bikes, but they're notoriously unresponsive, so this could have been something brand new. Another thing is that the racer AI in this game is absolutely relentless in the most negative way possible. They race flawlessly whilst never seeming to make any mistakes, and they also seem to be slightly faster than the player vehicle, which makes it feel even more unfair. The worst part about the AI, however, is that they never move, unnaturally blocking the track in an infuriating manner. Just get out the fucking way! And I've got a feel for the monster trucks and the big rigs in this scenario. because these are the bruiser classes, the fucker-uppers, and now they can't do anything, because pushing people out the way in this game, it just doesn't work. Brutal off-road racing my ass. It's especially funny too, because the zoomed out perspective, the unruly handling, well shit, this could have been a car combat game. It's not like other developers haven't made that transition. Oh, and that brings me to the camera. Such an underappreciated but clearly necessary part of any racing game. This is something this series has always done well. It's been reactive and exciting without ever losing track of the mechanics on screen. But I can't say that anymore. There are numerous options for the camera, but they are all shit for one very basic reason. All of the cameras in this game are way too close. I used the dynamic camera for most of the game, not that it made much of a difference, as it had the most amount of movement. But really, the biggest problem is that I cannot see the track at all. This makes the faster vehicles much more annoying, but it affects all the vehicle classes quite poorly too. The handling in this game is not sharp enough to be able to make these last minute turns, and the camera isn't keeping up enough, so it's just a fucking nightmare. I may be going a bit tinfoil hat time, and it is said that malice should never be attributed to incompetence, but I've got to wonder, is this bad design, or did they purposefully do this just to drag the game's length out? I mean, I'd like to say the design being bad is much worse, but no, they're both pretty awful. Regardless of the intention, it's just not a very fun experience. The slower vehicles in this game really do the heavy lifting in terms of enjoyment factor. Strange to imagine, but, well, not a lot of this game really makes much sense. And of course, how can I forget? The boost is gone. Most compelling contribution to racing game mechanics. Boosting so hard the fucking thing explodes, it just never gets old. It's another part of MotorStorm's DNA that's just gone walkabout. It's a crying shame too, because now the only way to overtake an enemy is to slingshot like a fucking moron through the corner. And the lack of boost to the largely useless feeling roster of vehicles makes this game ultimately feel very mechanically thin. The physics in the handling model aren't exactly doing much heavy lifting either, as even grazing a wall seems to bring the vehicle to such an unnatural halt that the whole event has to be considered foobar. The vehicles don't seem to land jumps properly, and all of this contributes to an experience that frankly makes this feel like a very lacking sandbox. In the early game, it's slightly clunky, but overall not too bad. But by the end of it, it becomes clear that there is nothing else going on below the surface. Nothing to play around with, nothing unexpected, just a very dry experience. If it's a novelty, then fine. But a novelty only lasts so long, and this one? Well, this one muddies the welcome mat real fucking fast. The modes of MotorStorm RC leave quite a good impression. There are a lot of genuine firsts for the series, and unlike most of the game, they're trying something new with an actual degree of success. There are 5 styles of event: race, hot lap, drift, pursuit, and playground. When starting up, it boots into gameplay straight away, and that really summarizes what this game is about. It has a leaderboard nature, short rounds with seconds shaved off each time. It's feel fairly serious for what the game is and what it presents itself to be. Loading screens are short, with a simple and unintrusive UI. It always feels like the action isn't too far away. I do find it strange that in a game as short as this, there isn't some kind of instant reset button, but, well, the game's got a few more problems than that. Races are, fine, I guess. They usually only last a couple of minutes at most, but the AI really does make this a difficulty. Nevertheless, it's a racing game staple in every perspective. Hot laps are the real heart of this game. They're trial and error events based on setting the fastest time, but they are fairly interesting. The times feel difficult to beat, but I like how these events are designed, and I think the pace of them is really good. Being able to just keep on trying without interruption makes it feel a lot more effortless. There's a lot of fool's luck involved with this event, but they're decently fun, and I enjoyed chasing the scores. Drift events, as already mentioned, are a muscle car exclusive event, and some of the most enjoyable in the game. Turn the Matchbox sideways and blast off. It's fun every time. It works very well on the more open tracks, and it's a fairly enjoyable game mode because it always felt like a breeze, whilst not being too easy. This is the one time in this game where the unruly handling actually makes a lot more sense. And yeah, it's a pretty fun time. Pursuit events involve overtaking numerous races on the track, and this event also seems to be the best and worst aspects of this game. On one hand, it's very fun to bob and weave between the vehicles. On the other, well, the physics engine just can't do it very well. The vehicles in this game just aren't as responsive as the game needs them to be, and the issue of the racers blocking the track is just so noticeable here. It's not a bad game mode, it's just a shame what game it's actually stuck in. The last mode is easily the most disappointing, the playground. An area designed to give it a little bit of respite between events, and try out the vehicles and just generally mess around. However, much like many other aspects in the game, it's woefully underdeveloped. If this didn't show up as soon as booting into the game, I don't think I ever would have noticed it. There are large jumps, and scaffolding, and basketball hoops, and overall it's just meant to be a bit more unregimented than the rest of the game. But again, the novelty just doesn't last. Football with cars, half-pipes with cars. I can't help but feel like that should have been the game. I mean, for fuck's sake, the Vita's got all these annoying fucking motion sensor gimmicks, and this game doesn't use them at all. I'm not too worried about that, but it kinda seems like a missed opportunity. Like, ironically enough, Little Deviants is much more of a minigame style game. The events are short and simple, perhaps even overly so. But they're fun. And the main problem with all these little things in RC is that they're so undercooked. They barely even register. The design of this area never really commits to anything, so it just feels like a big empty box. One feature that really impresses me though is the pit wall. Designed to spur on the competition between players, a pop-up will show in the corner of the screen, and bam, that's it, in a race. It is a fairly watered down version of the auto-log system seen in Need for Speed Hot Pursuit, but for the kind of game that MotorStorm RC is, it works quite well. It's also a stand-in for the fact that this game doesn't have any real multiplayer, it just has leaderboards. It doesn't have online multiplayer, but it does have split screen. And in all fairness to the game, this is easily the most fun I got out of it. It is fun to cut loose and just embrace the absurdity of it all. Game's AI cheats, but seeing two drunk fuckers on the track, well, it just makes it seem more plausible. And yeah, either most people are just bad at the game, and it would be very easy to blame myself because I am not very good at games, but they had to patch this game. And not a simple patch, mind. No. They brought down the difficulty values of times, of AI, of the tracks, pretty much everything. It's hilarious reading this because knowing what the game is now makes me wonder how fucking bad it was at the beginning. Also, this is the smoking gun I need to deflect any criticism of my lack of ability. Overall, the events and how they are framed are quite good. It's just a shame what game they've ended up in. Any other game, and unfortunately any other MotorStorm game, these modes would have absolutely thrived. Okay, so it's really hard to tell what fared worse, the vehicles of MotorStorm RC or the tracks. There are a lot of reasons why, and it is fairly easy to understand, but before I break it down, there are 26 tracks. Grizzly's Den, Scrap Heap, Sandstorm, Sun God Mesa, Pacific Drift, Wrecked, Charred Rock Cafe, Rip Slide, Frostbite, Icebreaker, Wind Chill, Eagle Peak, High Roller, Park and Ride, Roadblock, Cargo Hold, Shred Space, Skate Factory, Grindhouse, Shove It, Pint-Sized, Beach Party, Splashdown, Aquaplane, Sideshow, and Funhouse. Now this initially seems fine. 26 tracks is a great number. 10 of those are DLC, but even still, pretty good. But much like everything in this game, what Evo gives, Evo taketh away. Even the shortest tracks of the series, be it MotorStorm's Coyote Rage or Pacific Rift's Quicksands, they're nothing compared to the brevity of this game's tracks. And fittingly, they're not just smaller in terms of scale, as laps can last less than 30 seconds. In comparison to the other games, this does make RC's tracks feel quite distinct. But in terms of the game itself, beyond the obvious visual differences, they feel incredibly similar to each other. And this, unfortunately, has led to probably what are the least inspiring tracks of the series. And to be absolutely fair to the game, I'm in no way talking about the aesthetics, as they're pretty fucking primo. I should clarify, however, that the Pro-Am and Carnival expansions are a pretty separate experience for me. They don't have much of an interesting look between them, and in terms of purely physical construction, they are more or less exactly the same as the other tracks. So with that in mind, there are in fact 4 separate areas that define this game's tracks. These are all based on the 4 games of the series: MotorStorm, Pacific Rift, Hard to Kedge, and Apocalypse. And this is where the game really could have won me over, because in terms of aesthetic designs, these are absolutely beautiful. And they give off this facade of being quite a beautiful tribute. But they had to fuck with it. Aside from the visual basis, these tracks bear no relation to the original games. And in general, they just feel so much worse. And one major reason for why that is that engagement with the tracks is just incredibly thin. The series is famous for its environmental interaction. In the first game it was mud, in the second it was water and lava, in the third it was ice, and in the fourth it was, well, fucking collapsing buildings, I guess. And to a very small degree, some of that's been brought back here, mainly considering the mud and the water. But it's barely noticeable, aside from it being an occasional nuisance. The game doesn't have any of its own unique mechanics, and it really suffers because of that. RC cars are notoriously quite light. It would be nice if they had a jump button and occasional sort of pitfalls within the tracks that had to be avoided. But no, there's nothing. None of that. It's just this. And what's seen here never really evolves either. There are a few props on the track, but again, barely even noticeable. Just a few jerry cans or whatever that seem to just effortlessly get pushed out the way. And all of this is compounded and made even more egregious by just the overuse of fucking invisible walls all over this game. If I push a vehicle too hard going up a ramp, there's a good chance if I hit anything, it's gonna be, well, thin air. When the game occasionally stops being so fucking turbo-linear, like a deep pool or something just outside the track, it's an instant reset. Like, why even bother at that point? If it's just gonna instantly set me back, why is it there? And to give the game some credit, there are times when the tracks are actually quite fun. My favorite example is that there are a lot of half pipes and sort of wall rideable moments in the game. It reminds me of what was seen in Arctic Edge, but really it goes beyond that, because they're pretty much everywhere. And it's certainly fun to turn the vehicle on its side because it was in those other games. And the occasional optional ramp or divot into the ground makes the game feel a lot less dry. But that's just it. It is fucking dry. I thought Monument Valley was fucking dry, but this is a fucking outrage. Makes that Sahara Desert look like the shitting rainforest. And there is just shit obscuring the view half the time. It's as if they couldn't fully commit to the perspective. But all the lack of interactivity, the lack of depth, I could probably ignore all of it. But the tracks have just this major fucking flaw, and it's how they're designed. Going beyond the fact that they more or less play the same, mainly because these routes might as well be, the layouts are insultingly bad. So many long straightaways with sharp U-bend turns, and it's exhausting. And it really does feel cheap. I think they're artificially lengthening the game by making the tracks purposefully obtuse, and I probably would give them the benefit of the doubt if the camera wasn't so bad. But I think they know better by this point. The tracks just don't play that well. There's this constant stop-start nature to it all. Like, there are clearly some places where it seems like I should be able to cut a little bit of a corner or maybe launch myself. But no, the game just won't let me do it. And if they'd opened the experience up a bit more, I probably wouldn't have noticed how annoying the tracks are actually designed. The handling model ain't great, but in the playground area it actually plays alright. It's empty, but it is open, and probably where the game's vehicles shine the most, because the tracks don't just feel short in length, but also width. They feel cramped and repetitive, and when it comes to races, it's more or less the same experience each time, unless the difficulty is artificially cranked up. And so I feel that there are actually 2 ways they could have remedied this. One is that they widen the tracks and add a lot more interactivity. And 2, which I think is probably a little bit more realistic in terms of design, and I would have liked to see more, is instead of these tracks being based on repeat laps, they could have been sprint tracks. Boost might not be in this game, but there would never have been an opportunity to use it on these tracks anyway. But again, on a sprint track, it might have been possible. Even though the tracks all feel the same, it's not even the biggest problem, because the design they all stem from is fucking awful. So many fucking bottlenecks to just clearly push the player behind the other races. Out of frame sharp bends that clearly don't attribute what the vehicles are capable of. And I'm not fooled. Adding an occasional ramp does not change the experience, and it doesn't break up the fucking repetition. And yeah, whatever complaints I made about repetition or linearity in games before, it's fucking irrelevant now. Because this game's tracks aren't cohesive at all. And if they are, well, that's not for good reasons. There are times though where the tracks click just a little bit more, be it simplicity or openness. Again, I've got to reiterate, the designs aren't much different, but they just seem to be done slightly better. Examples of this would probably be Rip Slide or Sun God Mesa. A lot of the same problems are encountered on these tracks, but they just feel slightly more cohesive. With that in mind though, I ain't picking a favorite. It's one thing for them all to feel the same, but it's another for them to all feel shit. There's no sense of direction, and I usually don't ask for stuff like this, but maybe they shouldn't have made so fucking many. Can the tracks be fun? Maybe? I mean, kids can have fun poking a turd with a stick, but it don't mean I want to pull up a deck chair and crack open a cold one, cheering them on while they do it. It's not a fucking football game. Actually, no, I'd rather watch kids poke a turd with a stick than watch football. Point is, the tracks are just a bit shit. I said it before, but they should probably know better. Feels like something from a cheap indie game. Something that was made by a first-time team. So they don't really have an excuse. To conclude my summary of the tracks, I'll say this. If the goal is to be simple, there isn't anything wrong with that. But they have to be focused and have a specified principle, an underlying concept that holds each one together. The tracks in this game don't play to their potential because there are constant trade-offs without any kind of reward. The tracks are simple, but without refinement or a decent layout. The tracks are linear, without any interaction or engagement. They're not the worst things in the world, but shit! It's like pulling a margarita pizza out of the oven too early, and realizing there are only 3 ingredients, and none of them have come together. How does that get fucked up? How? Pardon me. Fortunately for MotorStorm RC, the presentation in general is much more cohesive than the rest of the game. Speaking purely to audio, it is fairly basic. It would be wrong to expect too much from the audio in this game, and I don't. Despite that, a spade's a spade. Engines are initially quite fun. They're high-pitched and they whir like the real-life devices, and they're kind of likable because of that. This does, however, wear off very fast, and the constant it not only gets repetitive, but also quite nauseating. There aren't a lot of ambient effects, and that really surprises me considering the nature of the tracks. But if there's one thing that's quite hilarious, it's the crashing noise. Vehicles don't properly crash like they used to, sure, but there's still sort of this battered plastic noise, and for whatever reason, it's way louder than the rest of the game. It's not all that bad, I suppose, but really this game could be played on mute and I probably wouldn't notice. With that being said, the music is pretty good. There's a fair amount of music in the game, probably more than the game deserves, and it's all been done specifically for the game. Now, I really do dislike dubstep, but I gotta admit, it does fit the game pretty well. Yeah, dubstep is grating and annoying and fucking repetitive, so it really does fit this game well. It fits the supposedly light-hearted and quick pace of the game, adding a bit more character and flavor to the game more than the atmospherics do. There's not too much to celebrate, but unlike the rest of the game, it feels fairly sure of itself, and there is actually a decent amount of variety. If there's ever been something this series has excelled at despite, well, everything else, it's always been the visuals. There's a lot to appreciate, and it's easily the aspect of the game I enjoyed the most and think is the most cohesive. Unfortunately, as much as I wish I could fully enjoy the experience and not be just a fucking cynical asshole about the game, there's one thing I gotta mention. For all the game's detailed environments, cutesy vehicle models, and quick loading screens, the game has a series first flaw. A dry desert bathed in moonlight, flowing magma burning ancient sand, frozen dunes iced with snow, and an urban jungle descending into a fiery sea. Each game up until this point has had its own unique setting, and so having a greatest hits approach in this one makes the game feel just slightly empty. As a counter to this, I'd like to say the Pro-Am and Carnival expansions provide a unique style and setting to RC, but in the face of the other environments, they just simply don't impress. But the areas really are tremendous, and they're clearly lovingly made. Frankly, after looking at this game after playing it, it's like eating a delicious home-cooked medium-rare steak as opposed to a Tesco own-brand basmati rice that hasn't been cooked. At a certain point, there just isn't much of a comparison. There's quite a high amount of detail, and certain effects like fire and heavy vegetation look great. The tide rolling in on some of the Pacific Rift maps also looks really good. But to see a snow machine get even just a brief appearance as a prop, that's a detail that just resonates a little bit more than any kind of visual fidelity. The lighting looks really nice, and even the nighttime tracks don't seem overly dark. Tracks can be a little bit too visually granular in places, but picking a more colourful vehicle seems to alleviate this problem quite quickly. There are just so many places to see. Festival tents in the desert, and crash planes in the jungle, boat encased in ice, and even the carrier itself floating upon the tide. It's all visually dynamic, and more than anything, it's just true to the games it's trying to replicate, because whether it's Monument Valley, the island, Antarctica, or the city, each one feels distinct as much as they did in those other games. And I especially love it because this may just be the most heavily saturated game in the series, and where this is really shown off well is how the color keys in this game are handled. Orange and green and blue and red. Each particular environment is given its own space of color, as it should be. Going further than that, the subcategories, meaning the tracks within those areas, are also distinct within themselves. And it's pretty impressive that they managed to pull it off, but they really did. They pop on screen to the point where they're almost a little distracting, because they're just so much fun to look at. Going beyond the minor satisfaction of returning to these places in another game, they're just really well handled. As much as I think these were really done this way for fans of MotorStorm, I think they're beautiful in a way that even people who aren't fans of MotorStorm could probably enjoy. They're just really well put together, and that's why the Pro-Am and Carnival areas just don't really work as well, and don't seem as visually cohesive, because these could be anywhere in really any game. Like this water slide track. Visually speaking, this just seems like a watered down version of whatever's in Pacific Rift. Pro-Am generally looks a little bit better because it's a little bit more shiny, but even still, it's not all that impressive. Like if I wanted to see the creator skate park sections from Skate 3, then shit, I just boot that fucking game up. Nevertheless, the four main areas of the game, which are clearly the focus, look fucking brilliant. Oh, but what about the vehicles? While I don't think they quite reach the heights of the tracks, visually speaking, the vehicles are really fucking impressive too. Again, gameplay wise, very weak, but in terms of design, these are good. There's just so much here and so much to appreciate. So many designs carefully modeled, and it's just really kind of a love letter to the series. Really neat to see some returning favorites. Series champs like the Azotsu Ronin, or personal favorites like the Atlas Earthquake. Each one creatively modeled and realistically simplified to resemble that of the original vehicle. There are just so many choices too, like, as much as I'd love to have seen the Lunatic Tree Frog make a return, it's nice to actually finally play as the Italia Tauromachia, after it effectively was an urban legend in MotorStorm Apocalypse. There's also a vast array of liveries to be unlocked for all of these. Tended to choose the default, mainly because this is how most of these looked in the other games, but frankly the choice is plentiful. There's also a lot of comedic designs, gnomes driving bumper cars, or the head case, or a basketball on wheels. There's a lot to enjoy here, and it's pretty sprightly. There's also a Domino's pizza delivery quote. Fuck me, how much do they pay for that one? Weird. Holy shit! And these designs are really fun, and I like being able to drive around as a fucking shed. The games before certainly didn't always have serious designs, so this is fine. To close out the visuals, I'll say that there's a continuity here that just doesn't apply to the rest of the game, and for that, the visuals just really hold up the rest of it. I know I shouldn't be surprised by now, but in this aspect, they've really outdone themselves. I suppose it's time to close it out. This game is, it's like the band's left, but there's still merch for sale. I came here to listen to synthesizer guitars and the sight of an overuse of Aquanet hairspray. It's like going to see Rob Halford thinking this new band's gonna be like Judas Priest, and then it's whatever the fuck this is. And in complete fairness to the team, a lot of the onus is on me. It's a different style of game to the ones I truly enjoyed. Of course I've got a bias. I love this shit. I wouldn't subject myself to sitting in a fucking box recording for hours on end in my fucking underwear if I didn't enjoy the series a lot. And I relate completely to the idea that this was a passion project for them. That's fucking aces, sure, but there's just something about that that really doesn't work with me. And it's the idea that this might be their passion project, but I don't have any passion for it. And frankly, I don't think half of them did either. That may sound overly harsh, and well, the next bit's gonna sound a bit worse. They wanted to make a Micro Machines style game. Great, cool, I like fucking Micro Machines. And they also wanted to make a tribute to MotorStorm as a series, as their creation. And that's great too, because I fucking love MotorStorm. But I don't think they're tributing it too well, because it doesn't seem like they understand what made those games work. And yeah, dipshit game designer over here, I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about, but surface differences, open maps, distinct vehicle classes, fucking boost. None of that's here, and it makes me wonder, why bother? Why make it a MotorStorm style game at all? Why not just make a Micro Machines style game? And this is the real cowboy boot to the cock, because they're failing at Micro Machines too. The original MotorStorm, when played ideally, briefly, was evocative, engaging, and most importantly fun. Given the same standard, perhaps even less of one, RC is parts charming and frustrating. But more than both of those, sadly it's simply uninspiring. And it's something this series has never been. It all just culminates in this very average feeling game, and that's being fairly generous. I usually have so much more to say about these games, so much to appreciate, so much to dig into. And I just can't with this one. There's just not a lot here. There's no meat in these bones. These bones be dry. Like, the functionality of the leaderboards is genuinely impressive, and one of the only times the game feels innovative and mechanically sure. It's really obvious that there are times when they're on to a good fucking idea, and then it just never really gets pushed all the way. It's a small game for a very small price. But there's a point I want to make here, and it's crucial to understanding this. I'd pay more for a better game. Like, is it good for the time, budget, and price point? Maybe. In all fairness, the Vita's lineup is pretty slim. But I really need to clarify something, because this is definitely not the fault of the Vita with how this game turned out. The Vita, despite its I'll call it lukewarm reception, is actually a pretty fucking good system. Like, it might even be my favorite portable device. If I didn't have nostalgia for the Game Boy, I mean, this would probably be it. Need for Speed Most Wanted, the Criterion one that is, proves emphatically how strong the system can be and how capable it is. Like, this is just a port of the home console game. The only things that have been stripped back are for the sake of performance. Mechanically speaking, it's identical to the home console counterpart. And the game doesn't even look that bad either, it looks pretty good. And maybe it's unfair to compare a completely different kind of racing game to this one, but again, I'd pay more for a better game. And it wouldn't be so obvious to me if it wasn't for the fact that MotorStorm Arctic Edge is about as good as a portable racing game could ever be. That game had its limits, and they still managed to pull it off. So what the fuck could they have done when the limits were even smaller? Alas, maybe they didn't have a choice. After the muddy release of Apocalypse, and the series as a whole being put into question, it is kind of surprising that it even came back. Despite releasing Little Deviants as a launch title for the PlayStation Vita, BigBig Studios was sadly shut down shortly after the game's release, and this kind of showed a shifting tide. This was Evolution's sister studio, and they were just sort of quietly shut down. And it kind of felt good, and it certainly brings me no joy knowing the great game that they made in MotorStorm Arctic Edge. But for Evo, it must have felt like the writing was on the wall. Reading into it a little too much, but in terms of MotorStorm, I'm surprised it even got a 5th entry to begin with. Yeah, I don't know if I'd really necessarily consider it a 5th entry or just something else. But hey, it was fun to see MotorStorm live on in other games, I suppose. This is it, right? No more? There's no more? Hit. PlayStation 4? There's a PlayStation 4. Drive Quad. Huh, well I guess this really is the end. This is the end. Really, this time. Well, roll the changes, huh? I mean, it's just sad to think that they could have ended on the most ambitious, most intricate, most batshit game in the series, but no, instead they ended on something kind of small and insignificant that... Oh my god. It really did happen again! So that's MotorStorm. 4.5 games on 4 different systems. Yeah, it's been a good journey. I've enjoyed all of these to some degree. Maybe not the last one, but the rest of these, they're fucking great. I mean, shit, I'd love to go back to these at some point. Yeah, it's a really strange note to end. Pinball Hero is MotorStorm. Can't claim to be a real MotorStorm fan if you didn't do that. We've been through this before. I'm not... If you want to do the fucking pinball game, you fucking do it, alright? I'm sick of this shit.
Did you ever do Devil's Weekend, or
did
you forget all the fucking DLC in the first game?
I just
fucking idiot.
Just want to drink, alright? Ah. And there it is. Closure for a sojourn made of perpetual motion. A farewell to arms for a truly well-worn veteran. Or a set of disappearing taillights yet to circle back around the bend. Well, a lot of memories behind that steering wheel. And they ain't shrinking with that rearview mirror anytime soon. So if this is truly it, then alright. Because it's been a real knockout. An indulgence of chaos. The euphoric need to run riot. A song illustrated by tended violence and wicked beauty, punching through the radio static, leaving a mark on any self-disrespecting lunatic brave enough to tune in. The steel guitar singing on the desert breeze, cutting through the cold with one resonant note at a time, drifting further and further down its own rhythmic highway, till it's flickering upon the very last chord of the sea. And that song's the fucking storm. I know we will be free again. Bring it on
something stirring.